Mississippi Freedom Summer is the name that was given to a turning point, not just in the civil rights movement, but in the nation's history. And that's one thing I want you to take away from today's talk, is that this was a big deal, not just in the civil rights movement, but for the whole country. To understand why it's so important, you have to go back in time. If you're less than 50 or 60 years old, you can't remember a time when America was divided racially the way it was back then. When I was growing up, it was pretty common to see ads like these. Come on. In my local newspaper in Massachusetts, because jobs and job advertisements were segregated. The South was obviously the worst part of the country for segregation. We all know that. There was segregated transportation, segregated swimming pools, public libraries were segregated. All of American life, the pursuit of happiness, was rigidly divided by the color of your skin. And it wasn't just the South. All throughout the North, there existed what historians call sundown towns. These were cities that had passed ordinance saying African Americans could not spend the night within the city limits. And Appleton was one. Here's a headline about somebody who missed his train and got stuck in Appleton. And it's not just far away. This is a map of Madison, and the little neighborhoods outlined in red are all developments that were erected in the 20th century, some as early as the 20s, some as late as after World War II. And they have racially restricted covenants like this outlined in yellow here. I'll let you just read that. I don't have to read to you off the screen. And you can see from looking at Monona, all the neighborhoods around where you're sitting right now had these racially restrictive covenants. Okay? It was illegal for black people to live where we're holding this meeting. So it was not just a problem in the South. I grew up in a suburb outside Boston. I graduated in a class of 1,000 kids. There was not a black kid in my community. There's no one in my school because of laws like this. Now, the civil rights movement focused on the South. Here in Mississippi, where the next few pictures are from, the population of 2 million was roughly 50-50, African American and white. The income distribution, standard of living, public health were all racially divided. Most of the jobs available to African Americans in Mississippi in 1960 were the same jobs their grandparents had had under slavery. Working in agriculture, mostly cotton, and for women working as maids in white homes. The living standards in rural towns for black people were what you see there in that center screen. Most schools for black children did not prepare them in any way for any life beyond what you see illustrated here. They were not, I talked to somebody in Mississippi in 2014 for the anniversary of Freedom Summer, said he did not hear the word algebra going to school in Mississippi. It simply was not taught. It wasn't until he got out of Mississippi that he learned the things we take for granted. And the segregation and this distribution of wealth and power was enforced by every institution in the society, backed up, of course, by the police with weapons. So Mississippi was typical of the South, probably worse, more extreme segregation enforced more brutally than in other southern states. But what you see here was typical from Virginia to Texas. This was the slogan on which the governor of Alabama ran for election in 1963. How many of you are old enough to remember George Wallace? Yeah, the 70s, ran for president, yeah.
He got shot.
And got shot, that's right, that's right. Of course, people had been protesting against this literally for hundreds of years. We tend to think the civil rights movement began after World War II in the 50s, but really there was resistance all along. The landmarks that we need to talk about today are the Supreme Court decision of Brown v. Board, which said that schools cannot be segregated. That if black kids and white kids don't go to the same school, the black schools are underfunded and inherently inferior. And it's better if kids get to mingle with all sorts of different kids. They come out as better adults. This, of course, was anathema in the South, and schools refused to do it. In 1957, in Little Rock, Arkansas, the local NAACP chapter organized a protest, and I'm not remembering if that's right, a handful of their kids went to the Central High School, which had better facilities, better classes, and the National Guard had to be called in to enforce federal law. So those kids could go to the same school as white kids. The same time was the Montgomery bus boycott. In Montgomery, Alabama, black people had to sit at the back of the bus. That was city law. And that's what it looked like. And if there were no seats at the back of the bus, they could stand. This woman, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr. in the background, was an NAACP member. She had been trained in civil disobedience. And when the time was right, the local chapter said, okay, don't sit. So there's this kind of myth about Rosa Parks that she was tired, she didn't want to stand. But it was well organized and strategic. And the black residents of Montgomery simply walked to work or organized carpools. And they held out for so long that the bus company was at risk of going out of business. They didn't have enough money. And they had to yield, and the city yielded. And this was the event that established Martin Luther King's reputation. He was an unknown local pastor before this. In 1960, students at historically black colleges decided that they would take the movement into the streets. Lunch counters at restaurants. It's funny to think we don't have lunch counters, right? Who remembers lunch counters in department stores? Yeah? Long gone. Imagine McDonald's, okay? Where you'd stop and get a bite. We're segregated. Okay, so if you, in every southern city, if you were out shopping and you wanted to get lunch, if you were white, you could sit at a counter and be waited on. If you were black, you had to go around to the back of the building and buy stuff through the kitchen door. Common practice, nobody questioned it until these young people. And it sparked a movement where tens of thousands of people in the early 60s said, I'm going to go sit at the lunch counter and I'm not leaving until you bring me lunch. Well, it provoked the response that was predictable. You can see here how the white residents, that last picture up there is Jackson, Mississippi, were outraged and then responded with brutality. The people who organized these events that we are talking about had been trained in nonviolence. The American people who embraced nonviolence, Martin Luther King being only the most famous of them, had themselves been trained by disciples of Mahatma Gandhi in India. Okay. Gandhi got it from Tolstoy, Tolstoy got it from Henry Thoreau. So there's like an American circle here. When the US government passed a law saying that interstate buses, Greyhound buses, type buses, the bus you take to, the Van Gelder bus you take to Chicago, could not be segregated, civil rights activists decided to try to ride from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans. And so they packed into a bus. This was organized by CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, and headed for New Orleans. When they reached Anniston, Alabama, they were pulled aside and the bus was firebombed. This event is worth investigating if you're interested in the history of civil rights, because the people in Anniston actually held the door shut, did not want the Freedom Riders to survive the bombing. When word got out, another bus filled up with protesters and left, and when they got as far as Jackson, Mississippi and got off the bus to use the bathroom and get something to eat, they were met by the residents of Mississippi with chains and pipes. One of them was from Wisconsin. He was a student at Beloit College at the time. He went home to Appleton where he's a minister. He's still alive and up there in Appleton. Well, this momentum toward civil rights prompted President Kennedy to draft a bill saying that it was illegal to discriminate on the basis of race. That if you were open to the public, if you were a restaurant, if you were a store, if you were a landlord, if you were a hotel, if you were an entertainment venue, you had to treat everybody the same way. Public means everybody. And he went on TV and announced it on June 11th. And a few hours later, after midnight, the head of the Mississippi NAACP was assassinated in his driveway. The person who shot him had a hunting rifle hidden in bushes across the street, and when Medgar Evers came home, he shot him. This was the last straw for many civil rights leaders. They called to the March on Washington, which is a famous landmark I'm sure you've heard of, which brought 250,000 people in support of civil rights to Washington. There's a movie on Netflix right now called Rustin, R-U-S-T-I-N, because Bayard Rustin was the chief organizer of this march. It's quite good. I think it's only an hour and a half. Give it a look. It'll give you some more background. So this is all leading up to Freedom Summer. All of what we've been talking about was not new. These are not new ideas. The people organizing and working for civil rights were only trying to make America live up to the promises it had made at its founding. It's important to remember that because we're often called, new ideas are often called radical. It's not radical, it's going backwards. It's not new. It's just trying to make the country live up to its promises. So what happened in Mississippi, the Mississippi Summer Project? In the fall of '63, the leaders of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, got together and thought they should do something dramatic. Nothing had worked. Bob Moses, the first SNCC volunteer, was sent to Mississippi in 1960. He spent most of the first few years finding out what people wanted, finding out what had happened there before. African Americans in Mississippi who opposed segregation were often brutalized, even murdered. There were, after the Civil War, in the 100 years until Freedom Summer, there were 500 lynchings in Mississippi. And SNCC, and it didn't matter. They didn't even get reported in the local press, much less change public policy or outrage the nation. So Bob Moses and the SNCC leaders in the fall of '63 said, well, what if we brought white college students down to try to register voters and integrate segregated facilities? What if the people who were getting beaten and shot and arrested were not poor black Mississippians? What if they were the children of bankers and politicians and lawyers and entertainers? And then maybe the nation would pay attention and there would be some change. So that was the strategy that the people had in mind who set up Mississippi Freedom Summer. One thing SNCC had learned, by the time these meetings are happening, there are perhaps 20 SNCC organizers in Mississippi working in different communities, almost all of them between the ages of 19 and 22, young people. So you remember that, young people did this. And they found that black Mississippians didn't want the same thing that other people in the South necessarily wanted. They weren't as concerned about integrating the schools because there was no economic route to success for them anyway. The jobs were all circumscribed, maids, field workers. They weren't interested in interstate commerce. They weren't going to take any buses to other states. Okay? They weren't even interested in public transportation being integrated because the bulk of the black population in Mississippi lived in rural areas. There was no public transportation. It wasn't an issue for them. And they weren't even concerned about integrating lunch counters and restaurants. They didn't have enough money to eat out. Okay? You have to imagine desperately poor rural people doing Freedom Summer for the most part. What they wanted, the SNCC organizers found, is they wanted the right to vote because they thought that if they could vote, they might be able to overturn the situation that they were born into. Voting was really important, as this chart shows you. On the left are all the counties in Mississippi. The next column is the number of black residents over 21. And then the next two are the number of are registered to vote. You can see that in some counties there were no black voters at all. 95% of African American residents in Mississippi could not vote. How many of you remember registering to vote? You maybe just did it if you moved here recently, or okay. You have to fill out a form. You go and you fill it out. They make sure you are who you say you are, and you're done. In Mississippi, in the early 60s, you had to answer a large number of questions, one of which was to interpret any article that you were given from the Mississippi State Constitution in your own words. And it was up to the person on the other side of the desk, the registrar in the county courthouse, to decide whether you had succeeded at that or not. Now, in many cases, the registrars in the county courthouses were illiterate. They couldn't have passed the test themselves. But they got to say whether or not African American applicants passed. The second big kicker was, in most counties, if you tried to register to vote, filled out all the forms, your name would be published in the local newspaper for 10 days, saying you had tried to register to vote. And that alerted the white employers, landlords, bankers who held mortgages, to the fact that you were trying to vote and change the status quo, and resulted in obvious harm. So between being poorly educated because of the bad schools and being intimidated by the structure I just described, the vast majority of black people were not registered to vote, didn't think they should register to vote, didn't think they should have anything to do with politics. Fannie Lou Hamer, one of the most famous of the Mississippi local residents to come out of Freedom Summer, says she had no idea that black people could participate in civic life. Nobody would have thought such a thing. So they wanted to vote. And SNCC chose Mississippi because it was the worst place in the country. If they could overturn the power structure in Mississippi, they could do it anywhere. So who was involved in this campaign? As you can see, they are young. On the far right there is Julian Bond, who went on to be the head of the NAACP. I don't know the other people in this picture. There were 120 paid staff of SNCC and CORE. SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, has been called the shock troops of the civil rights movement. They didn't want to bring court cases in Washington, D.C. They wanted to put their body in the street. CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, had been around for decades, and they were the chief nonviolent approach to advocating the nonviolent approach. During that summer, the NAACP and Martin Luther King Southern Christian Leadership Conference were busy elsewhere. They pitched in, but they sat on the sidelines. So SNCC and CORE and the other two formed a local organization called the Council of Federated Organizations, and that's who ran Freedom Summer. The headquarters were in Jackson. The planners looked like this. The guy in overalls there, Bob Moses, was the chief person. Also at the top was Dave Dennis from CORE. Bob Moses just died last year, I think. Dave Dennis is still alive. And they said, okay, how do we get hundreds of white college students to come down here and try to educate people how to register to vote? In total, there were over 1,000 volunteers who came south. You'll often see the figure 700 quoted on the web, but if you look at the original records, which we put online at the Historical Society, it includes attorneys, clergy, doctors, nurses, people who are not college students, and the real total is over 1,000. In more than 30 cities in Mississippi, they set up centers whose staff looked like this. The SNCC paid employees, the guy sitting on the right there was the head of this one in, I think this is Holly Springs, were paid $10 a week when there was money. Nobody else was paid. The white volunteers were put up in the homes of local black residents, which was shocking to everybody. the local black residents had never been treated as equals, had never shaken the hand of a white person, they said, and been treated like an equal. They'd never seen a white person who would live with the low standard of living that they were forced to live. And of course, these middle-class, affluent, white college kids from all over the country had never seen anything like the poverty they saw in Mississippi. Here's a Freedom School teacher with a couple of her students. One of the volunteers, Andrew Goodman, had been a freshman here in Madison a couple of years earlier. He went home to New York and enrolled in Queens College, and in the spring of '64, decided he would volunteer. But that's another local connection. In fact, there were Freedom Summer volunteer veterans here in Madison. I thought a couple whom I know might come today, but they didn't, unless some of you are and I don't know it. So it's not ancient history, it's people you know. Of course, it wouldn't have happened at all if there hadn't been tens of thousands of Mississippi residents willing to risk everything to house and support the volunteers who came south. The volunteers get celebrated, because of course they didn't have to do it. They chose to risk their lives to do this. But so it's easy to overlook the fact that the tens of thousands of local residents were putting themselves at even more risk, because at the end of the summer, those volunteers were going home. They were going back to college or whatever. And these folks were going to have to live there. And the worst violence in southwest Mississippi, in fact, happened in September and October, after the white volunteers were gone and the press was gone. Retribution came down hard. So what were they trying to do? You can see every little dot on the map there. It shows across the state where there were Freedom Houses and Freedom Summer offices. They were trying to register voters. That meant going door to door in the black neighborhoods in every town and trying to persuade people, which you see on the upper left, that it was worthwhile, that they should go to the county courthouse and try to register to vote. That woman at lower left is my favorite picture of all the ones at the Historical Society from that summer, is just bravely going to walk through the door and try to do it. In other towns, the volunteers organized voter registration drives, and 50 or 100 people would go together to try to register. And that one on the right had an interesting, that one's on the banners upstairs, I believe. Well, actually, both of those are. I was giving this talk in Mississippi for the 50th anniversary, and I put this slide up, and his voice in the back goes, "That's my father!" So this woman was thrilled to see her father taking his stand. So the first thing was open freedom schools. The second was to challenge the psychological oppression of black people in Mississippi by opening freedom schools. The schools, as I intimated earlier, did not give a good education to African American kids. And so white volunteers opened schools in churches, in people's houses, anywhere that was willing to hold a school. And they taught basic skills. They also taught cultural enrichment. There were things like art and music classes for the first time for these kids. A third goal was to build community centers, because everything was segregated. We're in a library. Public libraries were segregated, or open only a few hours a week to black residents. And so the idea was, let's build a safe place where the black community can come together for everything from reading books to public health. And the fourth goal, come on machine, was to invent a new political party, because since the Civil War, there had been no Republican Party in Mississippi. Republicans were the party of the North. Lincoln, the anti-slavery party, no one wanted to be associated with it. So Mississippi had always been a one-party state, like the Soviet Union. And so black people knew, since they were not welcome in that party, they were not allowed to join and participate in the only party there was. They had to start a new one. So they started a party called the Freedom Democratic Party. And their goal was to go to the Democratic National Convention that summer and say, we represent the state. All these white folks from the regular Democratic Party, they're not legitimate because no black people were allowed to vote when they were elected. We didn't choose them. The state's half black, half white. They're not legitimate. So they started their own party, open to white people, and it did have some white members, and they intended to go to the convention in Atlantic City and say, seat us, we represent Mississippi. And if they succeeded at that, when in the January of '65, when the Mississippi congressional delegation went to Washington to begin their congressional term, they were going to do the same thing and say, all those white supremacists do not represent Mississippi. We do. So this was pretty bold. What were they up against? Well, as I said at the outset, they were up against almost everything. Federal and state officials, like their two senators in Washington, worked to make sure that the federal government would not intervene. J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, refused to allow the FBI to be involved in enforcing civil rights laws that were on the books. He said that enforcing laws is a matter for local police. And Hoover, besides being a bigot himself, was under the influence of the Mississippi elected officials in Washington. At the state level, the governor and lieutenant governor made sure that the state patrol, the state police, doubled in size, and they set up a special surveillance organization which worked like the East German secret police, the Stasi, to infiltrate civil rights meetings and find out what was going on. At the local level, more police were hired. You can see on the left, that's the mayor of Jackson at the bottom, proudly pointing at how he's getting ready. They even bought an armored car. Cities and towns passed state laws saying it was illegal to hand out pamphlets and literature. I mean, obviously that violates the Constitution, but nobody was going to make that point in those towns. So new laws were passed. Oh, I'm not going to go back, sorry. Local business community had organized into what they called citizens' councils. You can see their motto there, states' rights and racial integrity. You can think of it as a white supremacist chamber of commerce. Okay? Every employer, every landlord, every bank manager had a loan belonged to the Citizens Council. One historian said that the state government in Mississippi in the early 60s was synonymous with the Citizens Councils. And then, of course, it was all backed by the threat of terror. This is kind of a stereotypical image of the Klan, but this is really what it was all about. The church there was bombed at the end of the summer. It had held a freedom school. And that quote from a white person in Mississippi emphasizes what I said before about the hundreds of lynchings that had occurred. Okay, so what happened? We're talking about 10 weeks out of hundreds of years of US history. What happened when these forces came together? In Ohio, in the middle of June of '64, 2 week-long training sessions were held. This is a press release that came out of SNCC. The majority of volunteers were white. They were not from Mississippi. The majority of them had never been in a segregated state or community. So they were trained in what they were going to find in Mississippi. They were trained in the principles and techniques of nonviolence. How do you put up with threats to your own life and not respond? Okay. Here's a couple pictures from training. On the left is not a reenactment, help me out here. They're staging a potential reaction when white people attack a group. In the middle in the black t-shirt is Andy Goodman, the guy from Madison, who had lived in Madison. At the right, a classroom session, and in overalls, Bob Moses talking about Mississippi. At the end of the first week, June 21st, they boarded buses and headed south, knowing that they were putting their lives on the line. And the second wave of new people came in to be trained. On the first day that people arrived in Mississippi, June 21st, 3 of the workers disappeared. They went to Philadelphia, Mississippi, to talk to the pastor of this church, which had agreed to host a freedom school and been blown to bits, as you can see. And when they were driving back from talking to him, they were pulled over by the police in Neshoba County, and the police held them for a few hours and let them go, and they were not heard from again. So they were missing all through that summer. Andy Goodman, being the newcomer, the guy on the right, Mickey Schwerner, had come to Philadelphia in January before the summer project as a Corps employee to try to work on voting rights. And James Chaney was a local activist who had hooked up with Schwerner. So you had Schwerner, who was from New York, and a local person who was working, and one of the Freedom Summer newcomers, and nobody knew what happened to them. But the rest of the summer project staff started anyway. And the routine ones, you get up in the morning, you hit a neighborhood you haven't been to yet, and you do this. You talk to these people, and you try to say, it's worth it for you to go to the courthouse and register to vote if you can. It's worth that your kids may be beat up, that you may be thrown out of your house, that you may lose your job for this. It's worth it, because nothing's going to change if you don't do it. On the upper right is a photo from a Freedom Day, a voter registration drive. I don't remember what city that is. And the bottom right are two guys registering to vote, and you can see the notice on the right says, after 10 days, applicants' names and addresses are published in the newspaper. Now, I don't know how you feel about voting. To me, it often feels pointless. I do it every time anyway. But would I risk my kids' safety? Would I risk my home? Would I risk my own life? I don't know that I would do it. So when you go through that exhibit upstairs looking at photos like these, think about that. How much courage did these people have to have? They opened more than 30 freedom schools around the state. That quote beneath the headline there, through the study of Negro history, they began to have a sense of themselves as a people who could produce heroes, was from a final report at the end of the summer on what had happened. I talked to an attorney in Mississippi for the 50th anniversary, the guy who said he had never heard the word algebra all through high school. And he said more than anything else in his life, it had changed his life. Because as a little kid, he saw all sorts of possibilities that he did not know existed. The political party organized, held meetings, drafted platforms. In the fall, which was an election year, they ran candidates after Freedom Summer was over. And so they learned organizing skills. 7 weeks in, the bodies of the people who disappeared on the first day were discovered. Their car was found first. It had been torched and hidden in the woods. Their 3 bodies were found buried in a dam that was being constructed on a remote farm owned by white folks outside Philadelphia, Mississippi. They had been tortured and then shot. Things went on. They continued trying to register voters, and the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City approached. So the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party chose delegates, and they sent them to Atlantic City on a bus, where there were demonstrators outside in their support. The convention was going to be really boring, because Kennedy had been shot in '63, Johnson was president, nobody was opposing him for the nomination. He was going to be ushered in. The only interesting thing going on was this challenge from Mississippi. When the folks from Mississippi appeared, they had to persuade the party, the official party's credentials committee, that they should represent the state and not all the white supremacists who were there. And the highlight, Martin Luther King spoke, lots of people spoke to the credentials committee. But what everybody saw on national television was Fannie Lou Hamer from Ruleville, Mississippi, who had worked on a plantation all her life and, as I said a while ago, didn't even know black people could participate in public affairs. She described going with some of her neighbors to a training session and then to trying to register to vote at the county courthouse, and being arrested for trying to register to vote by the local police and being held in jail and beaten for days. And with tears streaming down her face, she looked at the camera and she said, "Is this the land of the free and the home of the brave? Is this America?" And that resonated all across the country. It resonated so much that Lyndon Johnson in the White House, watching it happen, told the networks to switch. It was an emergency broadcast. He had to come on and intervene, so they stopped covering this, and all the networks went to the White House, where he talked about surgery on his dog or something. I can't remember what it was, trivial, because he did not want the nation to see this. Well, the result was the credential committees met, and they couldn't decide what to do. Finally, they reached a compromise. They would let 2 of the Freedom Democratic Party representatives join the white official representatives to represent the state of Mississippi. Fannie Lou Hamer said, "We didn't come all the way to New York for 2 seats." And the white people said, "Oh, we're not sitting with them." And so there was no Mississippi delegation at that convention. They left. Both parties left. The people in SNCC who had headed this whole effort felt betrayed, absolutely betrayed by the Democratic Party and white liberals. It was very clear that white liberals were not going to solve the civil rights problems in the South. Well, after 10 weeks, a couple of weeks after what we just saw, people began to disperse. Some stayed over the winter, but most dispersed, and they thought they really hadn't accomplished much. About 17,000 black residents tried to register. 1,600 were allowed to register. No political impact there. 40 freedom schools had been held, and yes, they were good. And they had a long-term effect, but there was no tangible short-term effect other than being bombed. 6 people had been murdered, the 3 we talked about, but there were 3 others, local residents mostly. 29 volunteers had been shot, dozens of buildings bombed, 1,000 arrests. And in the end, the people they thought would stand behind them let them down. So they had the SNCC people had a meeting that fall in Gulfport, Mississippi, to say, well, where do we go from here? What happens next? One of the things that happened was the Black Power movement. Some broke away and said, we should really be over there with Malcolm X. I'm not Muslim, they're saying, but we should, by any means necessary, seize our own power. And that's when the term Black Power in the race step comes out of this. Others said, no, we should keep organizing, but at a local level on a smaller scale. Harry Belafonte, the entertainer, footed the bill to send them all to Africa on vacation, where they saw black politicians and black airline pilots and all kinds of things that especially the ones from rural Mississippi had never really imagined before and found inspirational. So they were, besides having PTSD, disappointed in how this turned out. But it actually had multiple really good consequences that they could not see in the fall of 1964. First, the whole nation had watched on television as this happened. And it had happened to their kids, or people just like their kids. And the majority of Americans had seen these scenes and said, wait a minute, this is not the America I grew up wanting. This is not what America stands for. And so they pressured their political representatives. Second, the local people in Mississippi had gained a lot of practical skills in organizing. They had learned how to run meetings, how to write agendas, how to organize public events. And that stood them well in the future when things changed. The next spring, March 65 is only like 9 months, 6 to 9 months afterwards, was the March on Selma, which if you haven't seen this movie, you should see. I imagine it's on Netflix or easily available. When next door in Alabama, a coalition of civil rights leaders organized a march from Selma to Montgomery to demand the right to vote. That in front there is John Lewis, who was a representative from Atlanta, head of SNCC at the time. They started to cross the bridge out of Selma, and of course, as you've probably seen many times on television, were met by a police riot that beat them into submission. There's Lewis again being hit in the head. But the result of that, the public exposure of all of this, was the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And it specifically said two things that were important for changing America. One was, you can't have a test. And no more asking people to interpret the Constitution and saying they didn't do it right. In Louisiana, the registrars in the courthouses could ask any question they wanted. How many grains of sand in a pint jar? Nope, sorry, you don't get to vote. So no more tests. And second, if there was a pattern of discrimination, the federal government would just take over and they would put their own people in the courthouse and they would register the voters. And they did that all across the South. And this is the act that has come under attack in recent years by conservatives today. The result of it was that by 1966, the next time there were elections, the majority of black residents all across the South voted. They had registered and they voted. One of the Freedom Summer veterans that donated their papers, helped collect papers in Madison Forest, told us that she had been working in Louisiana for several years for CORE, and she was down there in the summer of '66, before the 1966 election, and she went to a bunch of meetings where candidates had to appeal for votes. And she remembered being in a church basement, and the white supremacist sheriff was running, and he had to stand in front of a black audience and say why he was the best person, experience and skilled in law and order and all this that they should choose for a sheriff. And everybody listened politely, and then when the election came, they threw him out. And so after 1966, everything from local offices, school committees, mayors, those positions became much more representative of the communities where voters lived. John Lewis had said this at the start, and indeed he was right, because without Freedom Summer, it's unlikely that the Voting Rights Act would have come about and been implemented. It's possible, I think, that the change of heart that white America had and the sense of empowerment that Southern African American citizens had, both of them can be traced to Freedom Summer. But so too can most of the reform movements of the 1960s and 70s. When you think of the 60s, bell-bottom pants and long hair and whatever, those countercultural movements were often led by people who had been in Mississippi in the summer of '64. Here's the anti-war demonstration, and the leaders of many anti-war organizations around the country had been in Mississippi. On the left there is at Berkeley, leaders of the women's movement around the country, the first women's liberation organizations in the country, of course, civil rights, the farm workers and Chicano Hispanic rights, gay liberation movement. This is Barney Frank, who went on to be a representative from Massachusetts, the first openly gay representative. Mm-hmm. Julian Vaughn there is a middle-aged man. So the change that we think of as the 60s grew in part from the efforts of people who'd been in Mississippi. Probably the best way to think about the change is this. Here's Lyndon Johnson's cabinet in 1964. Here's Joe Biden's cabinet today. Okay. Now, the diversity by gender and race, ethnicity, age that you see there, which you take for granted today, that this is normal. What was not normal before Freedom Summer? And the people who risked everything that summer of 1964 played a huge role in making this normal. Well, if this fascinates you, you want to dig deeper, take a picture of this slide, wisconsinhistory.org, Freedom Summer, because this is where the 40,000 documents are. There are ways you can browse. There are great ways you can search. If you know somebody who was there, you can search their name and find all the records related to them. the book that I pulled together of eyewitness accounts. There are two films which are superb and different about it. This one, made by Stanley Nelson for the American Experience series on PBS, is the more recent one. And he includes lots of interviews with people that are really shocking, of course. And it's up to date. It's a modern movie. You got that, Sharon?
Yep, very good.
There was one in the Eyes on the Prize series 25 years ago, which I watched this week to refresh my memory about all this. It's good too, but it's dated. It's old. You know, it's not like a documentary made today. But they're both quite good. I recommend that you watch them. They're both just about an hour long, an hour and a half long. And I guess that's all. Erin, you're opening the door. Can you turn the lights on?
Very good.
Thank you, Michael.